PTC'13 Program Committee Co-Chair and Executive Advisor for NEC Fielding.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a co-chair of the Program Committee of PTC 2013. Aloha and welcome to PTC. Let me introduce a keynote speaker, Mr. Malcolm Johnson, who is the Bureau Chief of the Standardization Bureau of International Telecommunications Union. And he has led the Bureau since 2006. And during his tenure, ITU has initiated a lot of activities, especially in climatic change and accessibility. And he was very recently involved in hosting a WCIT, a World Conference on the International Telecommunication Union in Dubai. And that's where several controversial proposals on international telecommunication regulations were debated, and if I may say, a highly contentious environment. So it'll be very interesting to hear what the Bureau Chief would say today. And he will kindly join the plenary panel immediately after his remark. So please welcome Mr. Malcolm Johnson. Thank you.
Good morning, aloha. It's a great pleasure to be here at, this is the 35th annual conference of the PTC, but my first. So I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this keynote this morning. It's a great privilege to be in the beautiful islands of Hawaii, especially coming from the cold winter of Switzerland. And the distance that many of us have traveled to get here just illustrates the remoteness of the Pacific Islands and the unique challenges that they therefore face. Unfortunately, many people in the Pacific Islands are not yet benefiting from the information society due to the lack of broadband connection and also the high cost of international internet access. And this was one of the main issues that was brought to the ITU events that took place in Dubai at the end of last year, and which I'd like to spend these few minutes highlighting some of the significant results that were obtained there. The extent to which the world is connected today, of course, is thanks very much to the evolution of international standards. 20 years ago, the effort was to move from national standards to regional standards, especially in Europe, but now, clearly, the emphasis is very much on international standards. And one of ITU's main objectives is to develop international standards that are non-discriminatory and also provide for interoperability. In fact, this goes back to the origin of the organization in 1865, when it was formed to ensure that there was a cross-border connection to the innovative telegraph system. Of course, today there are many international organizations developing standards, as well as a host of national and regional standards bodies and many forums and many consortia. And ITU is just one part of this jigsaw puzzle. Many different players contribute to the coherence and continuity of the telecommunications system, which is probably one of the greatest ever engineering achievements. But ITU remains a key player, thanks mainly, I believe, to the unique membership of the ITU. We have 193 governments members of ITU, but also, unusually for a UN agency, we have a large number of private sector companies that are members. In fact, around 450 private sector companies are members. along with many other governmental and non-governmental organizations, civil society, and since the beginning of 2011, academia can become members of ITU. And recently we've seen a great increase in the participation in our standards work from developing countries. And this again is one of our main objectives, is to involve the full membership of the ITU in developing standards, so that we produce standards not just for the developed world, but also for the developing world. And we found that developing countries are bringing their own requirements into the standardization process, and this is resulting in the development of standards that are very different from the types of standards that ITU has traditionally addressed. And these international standards are not just on telecommunications, but for ICT applications in a wide range of different sectors, including health, transportation, energy, buildings, etc. And innovations such as e-health, e-learning, intelligent transport systems, mobile money, and smart grids demands that the standards that are developed by the ICT industry are developed in close collaboration with these vertical sectors. For example, we can't produce successful standards for ICTs, intelligent transport systems, if we don't have the car manufacturers. For mobile money, we need the banks, and for smart grid, we need the utilities. We're making some progress in attracting these vertical sectors to our work, but clearly we need to do more in this area and to reflect the interdependence of these vertical sectors with the ICT sector and the standards-making organizations. So it was with this background that the first event, the Global Standards Symposium, was held in Dubai. And this brought together the heads of the international standards bodies, along with ITU. We had ISO, IEC, IEEE, IETF, and key national and regional standards bodies, as well as government and industry representatives. And this recognized that the ecosystem needed to be developed, and recognized that these vertical sectors, they have very different product duty cycles, they have different policy and regulatory aspects, issues of data ownership, safety, security, and privacy. And we need to take account of these if we're going to encourage them to participate in our work. And regarding collaboration with other standards bodies, it was recognized that with convergence, the traditional demarcation between work of these different standards bodies is becoming blurred, and there is an increasing risk of overlap and duplication. So as a result, there is a need for the development of cooperation agreements between these different standards bodies to lay out exactly who does what, and to try and work together to develop common standards, common international standards. And this view was taken forward to the World Telecom Standards Assembly, which followed the GSS. And in response to this need, it established a review committee where ITU and other organizations can get together and work out how we're going to address these challenges in the future. The Assembly addressed some new areas of work for ITU, in particular on working with the WHO on e-health standards, working with the Basel Convention on e-waste, and also working on software-defined networks, and to take forward our program on conformity and interoperability. And it appointed the leadership for the 10 study groups that are working in the ITU-T sector, the standards sector. And it's interesting that we have representatives on these leadership teams from 35 countries, and 24 of these countries are developing countries. So it shows the involvement now of developing countries in our work. And it also encouraged more participation from academia. We currently have about 50 universities participating in our work, and we're looking to encourage more universities to join us. One of the main concerns from this region is numbering and naming misuse, and this was recognized by the Assembly, and we will need to report any instances of misuse to the ITU Council to take action to stop it. And this was an issue which was also brought up at the World Conference on International Telecommunications to revise the International Telecommunications regulations, which is the only global treaty on international telecommunications. And this was the first time for 24 years that this treaty has been revised. So the new treaty covers such things as requiring member states to take action on misuse of numbering. It also calls for a transparency in roaming charges for mobile roaming and to reduce the roaming levels, to address energy efficiency and e-waste, and also accessibility to make sure that services are provided to disabled persons. And the preamble to the treaty recognizes the emphasis on freedom of access to the telecommunications service, as well as the need to respect human rights. So the WCIT made it extremely clear that ICTs are now a critical importance to the socio-economic development of countries. We had 151 countries participating there, and they were all very active in the negotiation on the treaty, which was something which was quite different from 1988. And the emphasis was to bring the full population of the world to benefit from international telecommunications services and the internet. We still have 2/3 of the world population offline, and we hope that this treaty will provide the basis for providing connectivity to the full world's inhabitants. So I'd like to invite PTC to work with us on ensuring that the decisions that were taken in Dubai can be implemented in this region. Thank you very much for your attention.
すいません、じゃあ行きます。じゃあお願いします。Yeah. Second. Please. お願いします。どうぞお願いします。Fourth, please. Right. そこお願いします。一番向こうなんかやります。はい、一番向こうなんかいいかな。Thank you, Mr. Johnson, and we go into the panel on policy changes in the emerging, changing market. We have distinguished panelists this morning from around the world. Let me introduce Mr. Dean and Professor Jun Murai of Keio University, who's well known to us as the father of internet in Japan, but he's member of the used to be a member of the board of governors, board of directors of ICANN, Internet Corporations, on assigned names and numbers, and he's on the advisory board, Prime Minister's advisory board on ICT technology. And Mr. Howard Schmidt, to the right, who was a special assistant to the president at White House and the cybersecurity coordinator, who just issued last summer, the international strategy for cybersecurity. And Mr. Toru Nakaya has been a Japanese government representative to many international conferences, and now head of the Information Communication Policy Institute. Thank you all for joining us. And let me, before moving on to the rest of the panel, let me briefly ask a follow-up question to Mr. Johnson. And I think people are, in the audience are kind of interested in the WCIT, World Conference on International Telecommunications, communication. So there has been a lot of written and said about the WCIT, and a lot of, I would say, questions or criticisms have been expressed by the media on ITU and its process of the conference. And could you kind of respond to that? Then also further comment is welcome. But could you?
Yeah, it was probably the one ITU conference that attracted most interest. As you say, there was a lot of hype in the lead up to the conference. But as I said, we had 151 countries very active in the negotiation. We had 1,600 delegates at the conference. And I believe that this has produced a much more representative and powerful treaty than the original treaty that was negotiated by a limited number of countries in 1988. But there were many divergent views, very strong views expressed on a number of issues, both in the preparation for the conference and at the conference itself. And a lot of emphasis was placed on the need to reach agreement by consensus. And because of that, many of the more radical proposals that were submitted to the conference were not included in the treaty. And I could mention, for example, routing regulation, differentiated pricing, equal rights for member states on internet governance, making ITU standards mandatory, and also proposal for an alternative dispute resolution for international connectivity matters, including the internet. And in fact, there is no mention anywhere in the treaty of the internet, which was, of course, one of the major concerns in the lead-up. But despite all the efforts to compromise, it's true that at the latter stages of the conference, there was one informal vote and one formal vote to agree on some texts for the treaty. And I think the emphasis here is that, you know, we strive for consensus, but you can only reach consensus if proponents are willing to compromise. And if there's a lack of willingness to compromise, then it can lead to frustration, and that can lead to member states calling for a conclusion by more formal means, such as voting, which is what happened towards the end. And then some question the number of countries that signed the treaty at the end. In ITU, normally you agree the final text, and then you have less than 24 hours before the signing ceremony. So just before the end of concluding on the text, we had one of these formal votes which added a new sentence in the preamble on recognizing the right of member states to access international telecommunications. So this changed the situation for some countries. They might have signed, they needed more time to look at this. But we still had 89 countries signing the treaty within 24 hours of the final text. So I think that compares very well with many other conferences agreeing international treaties. And it was a similar situation in 1988. We didn't get so many countries signing immediately, but eventually we had 178 countries committed to the treaty. This treaty comes into force 1st of January 2015, so we hope very much that by then we'll have a lot more countries acceding to the treaty. As far as criticism about the preparatory process, we organized regional preparatory meetings throughout the world, and these were open to all interested parties. I personally attended the regional preparatory meetings for Asia Pacific, for Africa, Americas, Caribbean, Europe, the Arab states, and the Commonwealth of Independent States. And many member states organized national consultations, which are open and made available all the documents for the conference to the public. And the conference itself, we had wide participation of all stakeholders. Many were represented on national delegations. And we made the conference open to the public. The plenary sessions were all webcast in 6 UN languages. In fact, we had around 5 million people following the conference online. And we also had captioning. So every word that was spoken in the plenary was actually captioned, and the text was archived. So you can even refer back to what was said in the plenary sessions. It's still online. So I believe that it's not true to say that we don't have a very representative treaty, a very great improvement on the previous version, and it's something I think that we can help base the further development of connectivity throughout the world. One thing it's clearly done is to emphasize the difference of views that are developing around the world, different national views and regional views with regard to global communications, and certainly drawn public attention to that. There's no single worldwide view, but there are many developing, emerging views that will need to be taken into account in the future. So I think this is the start of a long dialogue. It's certainly not the end, and ITU will certainly pursue its mission to connect the world. Just before I finish, I'd just like to mention that we have a broadband commission which ITU and UNESCO established to help promote the rollout of broadband, high representatives of government, industry, and it produced a report last year on the status of broadband rollout. It's a very interesting report. It's available on the website, and we hope very much that this will help to generate both business interest and politicians' interest in rolling out broadband. It emphasizes, in fact, very much the need for political support at the highest level, and this will be presented at the UN General Assembly. So I encourage you to have a look at that report.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the answer. And I think the underlying question here on this debate is whether or not the ITU should be involving itself more deeply in internet issues. And I'd like to ask Dean Murai on this issue. And of course, a further comment on any internet policy is welcome. But Professor Murai, you've been, so to speak, a founding member of internet. And since I used to work in the internet field a little bit too, so I kind of presume that you have a very different view on this. But could you kind of respond to the ongoing debate?
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm not having a very different view. I mean, I should say, because my background is I've been involved on the internet since start of the development of it, and then so the first, of course, internet development was engineering action, mainly from the academics, right? And therefore, the one of the characteristics about academics is boundaryless. It's global space by nature. Academics is always the academic conference and everything is global. So then we were talking about the IP, Internet Protocol, which is basically the passing the digital bits around the world. So a very, very almost no concern about the national boundary, right, for the development of the internet. So naturally, the internet is the mother of the global space. That's a very important point. We still think that one. And then one day, the internet standard body like ITF was running with a DNS, domain name system, which is basically mapping the name to the IP address, right? And then one of the discussion raised that who's going to take this particular domain? Domain is a global space, and then taking one. And then somebody took mtb.com, and then another person said, no, MTB should belong to a MTB company, but it was originally not. And then there was a kind of debate and discussion started. And then I was picked as one of the representatives from the internet community to talk with the organization called the WIPO, one of the United Nations-based organization, right, to handle the intellectual property. And we had a kind of small group, and on the same table, we started the discussion. And then, so we said IP network, and they said IP is important. Their IP was intellectual property. Our IP was internet protocol. So we used a different language, right? Okay, so I still have a kind of a similar concern about what the internet is, what kind of internet we are talking about, right? Because the internet can be viewed as an IP network connecting the global space, which is the basics of a digital bit. And this is a very much a kind of engineering development and operation. But now, 20, 30 years passed, and the people started to use, and the society started to use the internet. And then there is a lot of impact on our life, our society, government, and everything. So now, when we are talking about the policy of the internet, then which internet are we talking about, right? Is there the definition of the internet before the discussion at ITU? That's the point, because from a people's point of view, there's diversity of understanding about the internet, right? So that we, for example, very original internet developer still thinks that the internet is an IP network, connected IP network around the world. And then many people, users, think that the internet is application, right? And then the internet is a means of a communication, individual voice to be heard, and for democratic reasons, it's important. Now, both are true, but my point is how we can have a kind of a predefinition of the term, and then go into discussion. So is that happening properly? That's one question. The second point of mine is when I was asking my 18 years students, right, the other day, that what do you think about the future of the internet? And then one of the students raised her hand, and she said, how long we still gonna keep email on the internet? And then we all thought it's kind of a strange question. And then I asked her, do you use email? And she said no. She's a heavy user of the internet. She doesn't use email. And then because the SNS and the other application can make her communication very well. And so her question was about there was a lot of old application on the internet, like a FTP, and then they don't know about FTP, file transfer protocol. And now they are starting to forget about the email. Okay, that's fine. So evolution of the technology on top of the internet. Internet is a platform for the creativity, innovation, and the new thinking, new way of a solution of any problems of the human being. Okay, that's a basic digital technology's benefit and the purpose. So the human being can be very creative. So they are developing the new things always. So evolution is very fast. Okay, so my second question is, since internet, from the application point of view, it's changing every second, right? Okay, tomorrow, we will never know what kind of application we are using. And then what's kind of understanding about the internet? It's changing from the society's point of view and the people's point of view. So the question is, how can we catch up? I mean, from the discussion and decision-making process, okay, in order to make a decision with a group, then what are we expecting? So it takes a year, 2 years, 3 years. How can we make a decision expecting the internet in 3 years future? So that's kind of how can we make a decision thinking with the evolution, very rapid evolution of the technology. So that's a second point I'd like to raise.
We'll get back to you later, but since we are running short of time, can we go into a little bit the different aspect of internet? And Toru might have something to say on this, like cybersecurity issue, but I don't want to skip you, but you have ample time in the afternoon, so. But anyway, you worked on the internet governance discussion, and at the APT you drafted the cybersecurity sort of related sentences, and so you might want to say something, but if we have time, I'll give you time.
Later
on. Mr. Schmidt, you've been sort of the head of the cybersecurity policy at the White House, and you issued the international strategy for cybersecurity of the United States government. And I understand the telecommunication is a sort of declared sort of critical infrastructure, as you may say. And so let me ask you, why is that, and what that means to the international community? And also, in this conference, I think the audience are interested in the implication, any implication of the the conversion of IP-based network and old telco system on the cybersecurity. And could you kindly respond to that?
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here with my distinguished colleagues, and not only from the universities, but the ministry and ITU. I know Dr. Torre, the Secretary General of ITU, and I have had a number of discussions about the world as we see it today, the traditional telecom that I think the treaty that Malcolm had mentioned had evolved from, and what it means in today's world. But it's interesting to the two specific questions you asked. The first on identifying telecommunications as critical infrastructure. I think when we looked at the evolution of just point-to-point wires, and then we went to the SS7 system, and we started using satellites, undersea cables, oftentimes they seem to be owned by companies or governments or some combination of the two. But the difference in the internet today is, as you mentioned quite eloquently, is we all depend on it. I mean, even preparing backstage here, the last minute I'm on my iPad, checking email, communicating. Of course, in the U.S., two important events were taking place. The president's being inaugurated. We have a national holiday. So as a consequence, everything that we do is tied into this. And I remember in the early days of the internet, I think when I first got in, there were about 11,000 of us that were on there, and by today's standards, it's a very, very small part of the internet, but back then we thought it was large. One of the things when we start talking about critical infrastructure, and really what it means is, think of what your life would be, in some cases it'd be better, but if a day without the internet, and think about the first hour, which seems good. I don't have to do email, I'm not doing all these other things that seem to be distractions. By the end of the day, we find out, in many cases, we can't even purchase something at a grocery store. We can't communicate with loved ones, particularly using voice over IP. So when the president, when I started appointed in December of 2009, the president said, what are the really critical things we need to worry about? Energy sector, of course, is one of the answers we gave. The international financial system, we all know, is very critical. But the telecommunications infrastructure has a unique position, because not only is the mechanism by which that we achieve all the wonderful things that telecommunications and the associated IP-based activity that takes place over it or with it, but it also is that same mechanism by which a lot of the bad things happen. And when we start looking at cybersecurity in the telecommunications infrastructure of the 21st century, we should never and we can never be looking to building out the next generation, whether it's 5G, 6G, whether it's voice over IP, whatever the technology must be, we can't build it just because we have a small group of people that effectively control it, because we all own and operate it now. And I think that's one of the difference in when Malcolm was talking about the ITU and the discussion, is this is no longer something that is government's control. My computers, every one that I have here and every one's at my home, they are part of the infrastructure, so therefore we depend on it. The other thing, very briefly, on the convergence, and this becomes a challenge, whether it's from a taxation, and I hate using that word, or if it's a revenue, whether it's a tariff perspective, there are things that take place on an IP network that seem to be somewhat unique. But I don't think they could take place without the fundamental telecommunications infrastructure to support it. As we move into some of the new satellite systems that are almost strictly IP-based, we'll see some of that changing. But right now, it's hard to tell when you pick up a mobile phone where you're in the IP world and when you're in the telecommunications world, when one starts and one ends. So as a consequence, in the thing that I care about most, and I'm a technologist, so I love the technology, but how do we secure it? It's how to secure something you have very little control over, and we should not have control over. I think we're very happy with the multi-stakeholder governance mechanism that has got us to where we are today. But how do we make that more secure by engaging people without overbearing anyone with regulations that also times, in many cases, I think inhibit innovation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And any sort of further response to cyber security issue from other panelists on the international cooperation or anything? Or if not, okay. So Toru, you got time. So before questions and answers, I give you 2 minutes, and you can say anything.
Yeah.
But he's got ample time
No, no.
for presentation in the afternoon. So
Thank you, Mr.
don't worry.
Sakamaki. Well, actually, the point Mr. Schmidt said at the end is really important. Well, actually, multi-stakeholder approach is now becoming essential for considering protection and cybersecurity in particular. We have to involve a lot of stakeholders. Otherwise, we can't implement the measures to protect something or to secure something. And even in the ITU conference, in particular, WCIT, he made a great effort to involve many stakeholders so that we can reach a consensus which can be truly implementable. And actually, the involvement of multi-stakeholder is really important from the outset, not only the implementation stage, but also the policy-making stage. Without having their views, we can't reach on the pragmatic or practical measures which can be implemented promptly or in a timely manner. So I do believe the multi-stakeholder approach should be now in common for everything around the internet. Thank you.
Is that it? Okay. Okay. Thank you. Now we have some time for questions from the audience, but if there's any question to the panelists, please raise your hand, please. It's hard to, sir, please. Microphone will be, I think, to.
This question is for Mr. Johnson. Traditionally, it's a long cycle, the process from identification of a need for a standard and publishing of the standard. How and to what extent has the use of information and communication technology helped speed up the whole process? Can you give some benchmark results from they were using the technology today?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, the processes in ITU are very different now to what they were just a few years ago. I mean, all our meetings are paperless. Every delegate has a laptop. And the approval process is also much quicker than before. So we can produce a standard very, very quickly now. I mean, let's take the example of the universal mobile phone charger. This is a standard I think everybody welcomed because it actually specifies the end connector to the mobile, the micro USB. And all the major vendors signed up to this standard before it was adopted. And it also reduces the energy consumption because it doesn't use any energy when it's offload, which has been calculated to save 13.6 million tons of CO2, because you multiply a charger by 6 billion, it's a lot of energy. So that was proposed, I recall, in July of 2010, I believe it was. And that standard was first consented, as we call it, first step of approval in ITU in September the same year. And then it was finally approved in the following February. So it shows you can move very, very fast. Obviously, if it's a more complicated standard, it's going to take longer. But the process in ITU is that it's our private sector that drives the standards, of course. 95% of our recommendations, as we call them, are developed and approved by the industry members. And we have a separate approval process for that, so that when there's consensus on the standard in the study group, and the chairman determines whether it's consensus or not, doesn't mean unanimity, but once there's consensus on that standard, it's consented, it goes on our website, and then if there are no comments within a 4-week period, it's been approved. And when it's been approved by 193 governments. So it's a very nice combination of private sector and governments. So the process can be very fast, and people that haven't been to ITU for many years, they still think of it as it used to be, quite slow. But now it's one of the fastest, and in fact for approval, it's the fastest approval mechanism we have. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, one more quick question, and as she's saying that we have 2 more minutes. Excuse me. Yeah, sir. No, ma'am, please. Yeah. You can. I mean, okay then, sir.
Right, Tricia Paoletta with Wilshire and Granis. From press reports, one of the reasons why the U.S. did not sign the treaty was, in part, cybersecurity being proposed to be included in it by some other countries. And ITUT is doing work in cyber, so I'm wondering from your perspective, why wasn't that work considered sufficient? Why did other countries want to bring cyber into the ITRs? And from Mr. Schmidt's perspective, since you were responsible for U.S. cyber, did you feel there's a lack of, or did you look to the ITU work in terms of cyber, or was what the U.S. was doing for its own networks, considered sufficient? Thank you.
Quick answer, please.
Perhaps I'll just mention what actually happened,
Please,
and then
yes.
Howard can say whether it was a good thing or not. But yeah, there is an article there which calls for member states basically to cooperate together to ensure the security and robustness of the international telecoms network. So that was the conclusion. The cyber security is not mentioned. It's security and robustness of the network, and the need for member states to collaborate together to ensure that. That was the outcome.
Yeah, thank you, and that's a wonderful question, and thanks for that, because before I retired, one of the big discussions we had about what's going to happen in WCIT, and more broadly, what's going to happen in ITU in the future. I think there's a couple key points that are vitally important. To emphasize once again, the multi-stakeholder approach didn't seem to be part of the discussion going into a lot of the workup for the WCIT. The second piece of it, when you start looking at what other nations were doing, it's difficult to come up with, number one, move ITU from a straight telecommunications body into an internet IP-based environment, which is sort of outside the lane, I think many of us believe. But secondly, some of the nations, even the discussions we had, they were not given the capability of making sure we had openness, innovation, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, those fundamental rights that are covered under by many of the treaties that currently exist, they didn't seem to exist there. And the motivations where you start looking at governments controlling the internet is just something that I think we're very much opposed to. I think many of us of the internet age are opposed to, and having it sort of being put in at a well-working body like ITU is just something that we felt was untenable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we ran out of time. So for further questions, please come to the afternoon session. Mr. Johnson offered to be in the audience. So thank you so much, and please join me applaud the distinguished panel. Thank you.